say what the book is. I mean, what the book is that I'm referring to, but it was quite an interesting process anyway, an interesting challenge. So the reason there are no footnotes is not because I neglected to put them in there, but because the rule of Raritan is that there are no footnotes. So as I say at the beginning of this paper, I had this long-standing preoccupation with Fourier from the time I was a graduate student many decades ago. And the sort of opportunity, I always thought I did a paper on it when I was a graduate student in a seminar, and I always I knew there were things I didn't understand about the sexual revolution that Fourier is proposing, and that in fact, I and many of his commentators in the earlier years just neglected or treated as the kind of crazy side of a more or less socialist set of proposals about communal associational organization of production and of living and so on and so forth. But then last year, I had finished a book. I didn't have anything else I was particularly wanting to do. I thought I could go back to Fourier. And then I was invited to give a talk at the Davis Center at Princeton on revolution. And I thought, okay, Fourier's sexual revolution. And so I went back to Fourier and did a lot of additional reading, but mostly sort of thinking about all of this. The other thing that happened in the course of this was that the Foucault lectures, the early versions of what became the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, those Foucault lectures, I don't remember the dates now, I think it's 68 and 69, on sexuality, on psychoanalysis, were just published last year. And so I went back to those to sort of get some kind of inspiration, and sure enough, Fourier was in them. Fourier, who was completely dropped from the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, when it comes out a couple of years later. But in those lectures, he sort of interprets Fourier in a way that I came to see was not the way I did. And I guess I have to say that as a kind of devoted follower of Foucault, I was surprised that I could disagree with him. I mean, I don't know how many of you sort of have this, when you're reading an important theorist, you feel like you have to agree with everything they say, or you feel like they're smarter than you are, and you really, you have to kind of admit to their interpretations. And Foucault's interpretation, and this is one of the things we might want to talk about, Foucault's interpretation is that any classification or systematization of difference suppresses desire. And I kept thinking about that. I was reading it, and he then cites Fourier as an example of this. And the more I kept thinking about it, the more I thought, no, that's not the Fourier I know. For the Fourier I know, it's not so much, it is the classification of difference in some ways, but it's also the proliferation of difference in excess of any possible imagination of its combinations and its combinations and reassortments and reconnections. It's difference that produces desire, and that it's desire that for Fourier is the animating force of social life. And if desire were entirely liberated, then all of social life would be livable, happy, fulfilled. If you want to think about Lacan, the absence of lack is for Fourier the fulfillment of desire rather than the provocation to desire, as Lacan would have it. So I was just fascinated with Foucault's sort of discussions of that in those 2021, published in 2021, but the 1967, 68 lectures. And so that was one of the interesting things for me in this. What was difference, or how was difference being understood? A difference that at once included sexual difference, but refused the binary of sexual difference. Being not only interested in every other form of sexual encounter that you could possibly imagine, but the various possibilities and combinations of different forms of binary gender sexual arrangements. So that was one of the interesting things for me. The other one was actually provoked in an early version of this paper. One of the things about not being able to do acknowledgements in Raritan is that I couldn't thank people who contributed to this. And I first did versions of this in a seminar with Max and Banu and a bunch of others at the Institute. And Max kept pushing me on the question of excess. And so the way in which these sort of really crazy, excessive articulations and formulations function in this Nouveau Monde Amoureux, particularly the book I was most interested in, but in the Fourier in general, the whole thing is one big excessive fantasy about what life should be like as opposed to what life actually is. So that was another of the interesting things for me. The sort of even what I argue in the paper is that even the seemingly concrete mathematical assignments, there'll be 1,620 people in every philanthropy in every small community. Even that mathematical precision is ridiculous. I mean, or excessive when you read it. There's a thing in when I say, he has all of these things, which are calculations always. There are all these different types of infidelity and concubinage that occur in civilization. There's 64 different types. The number of lovers that be satisfied by pairs like Psyche and Narcissus, 20 each. Proportions of children organized in little hordes. Those who would like to collect garbage and those who like to be nice or precise. Girls to boys, 1 to 2, or 1 to 3 to 2 to 3. Manias in a pocket. I mean, endless sort of mathematical calculations, which he even at one point says he really can't pin down because they exceed the possibilities for him to do the kinds of calculations he wants. So so excess is the second one. So difference is one, difference and desire is one, excess is another. A third that we might want to think about is the way in which this functions as critique rather than as a plan for utopia. Critique in the sense of offering an alternative to the claustrophobic, repressive, unhappiness of what he refers to always sarcastically as civilization. So how to read it as satire and parody as much as a plan, a serious plan is another thing. I mean, everything in the biographies about him suggests that he was far from a humorous type, but there is something about the craziness of the language and of the stuff that he kind of offers you that feels often as if the point is to tell you how bad things are for you now, as opposed to offering you the perfect plan for how good they might be in harmony, his vision of what the future would be. And then finally, there's the place, the really interesting place that homosexuality and particularly lesbianism takes in this rendering of things. I mean, he declares himself in the service of lesbians. There's one point where he says, let's see if I can find it, where he actually says that at age 35 or whatever it was, he realized that he was in love with lesbians. What is it? Where is it? I discovered, when I was 35, I discovered that I loved lesbians and was eager to do anything to please them. he figured he was one of some 26,400 people like me in the entire world who were driven to serve these members of the opposite sex in their ambiguous and direct modes of relation. And so on gay men, he's less interested in, but he needs to acknowledge that as part of the logic of the arguments that he's trying to make. So that whole issue of what that constitutes, I mean, I come to a conclusion in this of some kind when I say I think the erasure of phallic desire to dominate women is the point, that he sees in lesbianism some alternative to the ordinary male-female, the subordination of women to men in any sexual relationship. So, but there's other ways we might be able to think about it. In any case, those are the sorts of things that I played with and played around with and worked on in this. And it raised for me some questions beyond Fourier, although I'm not sure that's where I'm going to go. I mean, I think in some ways this was a one-off paper. It was a debt I owed to my graduate self, an unfinished exploration of something, a paper that I always felt was inadequate and wanted to rewrite, and finally had a moment 50 some years later when I could do it. But it does raise the question about the phenomenon that this course that I was taking when I wrote the first Fourier paper at the University of Wisconsin in 1964 was about these utopian communities, and these utopian communities in which sex was the crucial organizing principle, whether it was asexual communities like the Shakers, or communities like what was the one that Noyes did? But these communities that were Oneida was Noyes. That one was about male sexual continence. But the preoccupation with sex, the control of sex, the issues about masturbation, we're talking about the early 19th century, 1820s, 30s, 40s. All of that seems to me needs to be thought again. I know there are books that have done some of this, but not a lot, in terms of the kinds of problems that Fourier presents as a professor of desire, or as somebody sort of wanting to think against, I would say, a certain kind of modern capitalist order in which the place of the nuclear family is an increasingly crucial one. The place of the understanding of sex as reproductive for the family, the race, and the nation is crucial. And these are refusals of that vision of modernity. But what to say beyond that, I just don't know. But I do think that Fourier raises the question of, and I think I say at the very end that for that reason, it makes sense that Marx and Engels, while wanting to distinguish themselves from him, talk about him as a socialist, because the sort of social arrangements that he's imagining, the communal arrangements that he's imagining, are part of the critique of capitalist modernity, but in a very different form from the one you get in Marx and Engels. So I'll stop there. I'm sure I hope you've read it, because actually, if I say so myself, it's a fun paper to read, or I hope it's a fun paper to read. It was hard work, but I had a lot of fun writing it. And I do feel that I've settled accounts with Joan Scott, the graduate student, and who didn't understand the paper that she was trying to write in 1964. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Joan. There is a question already. Anjali.
Yes, Anjali.
I'm sorry to rush, Joan. It's so lovely to see you, but I'm on the road and I want to make sure I ask you this question because I was so intrigued by your paper. I read Fourier in graduate school too with Peter Stalibras on a class on parody.
Right.
And we referred to Fourier as the ultimate servicing bottom because he loved lesbians so much. But my question really is about your invitation to think psychoanalytically about the text.
Mhm.
And I wanted you to hear a little bit more, and I know you're probably not going to write on more about this, but about the relationship between mania and melancholy vis-a-vis the object. Because you end, I think, the essay, especially when you're talking about lesbians, you invoke this idea of mania. So I was really intrigued with mania and its relationship to excess, but there's also melancholy because of an object. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about whether you kind of navigated that landscape and how you, I mean, I'm thinking about the Freudian mania, that, like, I mean, there's different genealogies to the idea of mania as well. But the idea
how are you thinking that we could link mania and melancholy? That's really interesting, because I don't think of him as melancholy.
Because I mean, as you know, I've been thinking about abundance a lot as a kind of, as not a refusal, but as a kind of interruption of the preoccupation of melancholic historiography, right? So that's the recuperation of the lost object is not, you know, it's the attentiveness to loss as the recurring form. And in this case, you're suggesting that, you know, if I were to do a kind of garden variety description of mania, it would be that you're kind of depressed and you want to get over it and you just flood yourself with things that cover over the loss. So it's often construed as the opposite of melancholia, but I thought there was something interesting going on because you started off the essay with his sort of, you know, the sexual difference, like what's the thing that is lost, right? What's the object? I don't know if I'm making sense, but I loved it so much. It made me think so much about my own graduate experience. So whatever you fancy, or you could say it's rubbish, I'm not interested.
No, it's really interesting. I have to say, Angela, you look like you're on the road.
I am in my car. I
know your glasses. It's just when your picture came on the screen, I thought, my God, she really is on the road. Very strange. Anyway, I think that's really interesting. That, I mean, I guess the if we could say that mania is a kind of depression, then it's civilization, that it's repression in civilization that is the source for him, right? It's the, you know, that first quote about the French Revolution missed the boat when it didn't abolish marriage as the one of the revolutionary transformations that had to happen. So I think, and so then his mania, or the way to overcome the depressive state of mania, I mean, this is maybe just repeating what you said, is to unleash that which has been, if not lost, repressed. Because I think for him, it's repression that is the source of all of the discomfort or the loss of desire, or the corruptions of civilization, whatever we want to call it. So what's offered to compensate for that repressive loss is a vision of abundance beyond which you can imagine yourself, and it's somehow the way back to the more natural state. It's something like that. I mean, I think because I think it is, you know, unlike Foucault and the argument against the repressive hypothesis. I mean, this is a repressive hypothesis. This is like, you know, they've caged us in ways that have to do with alienation at work, alienation among potential partners, communal alienation. And it's no accident that, you know, these teams of workers sort of take time off for sex. They're on their work teams because they're attracted to each other as well as to whatever the work is that they have to do. So the liberation of sexuality becomes the glue of an alternative civilized or an alternative culture or alternative community that will somehow wipe all of that out. And the mania stuff, I mean, those forms of mania, including his own diagnosis of it, are again symptoms of.
I was just looking at it and I was like, next time I see it, Annika, you're gonna ask me if I've eaten the fruit.
Gabriel, you should mute yourself.
It's somebody who's not muted, right? All kinds of interesting things can happen that way with muting and unmuting. Anyway, I just think it's the mania is symptomatic of the crisis or corruption of civilization, including his own mania. But the mania for lesbians is sort of both a kind of pathology, but also a cure, because he opts out, or allows him to opt out of the patriarchal domination that otherwise male-female sexual relations might entail. That's as good as I can do, I think, with that.
Okay, thank you. Banu has a question.
Thank you, Joan. Reading this text this time around, perhaps because of what I am reading currently at the moment, I was really struck by how deeply anti-Malthusian Fourier's work is.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, I mean, I think there's only about a decade of difference between the two works, Malthus being just 10 years earlier. And both works are about food and sex, as you characterized it. But of course, they come at it from entirely opposing directions, whereas for Malthus, the abundance of sex creates population growth that always outgrows the availability of food, and therefore has to be regulated virtuously by way of marriage. For Fourier, obviously, it's sort of an overturning of Malthus on both of those, both in terms of sexuality not intended for reproduction and plenty, both in food and in sexuality. So this is more of a comment than a question, I guess, but I was struck by how that opposition really informs some of the thematics that you are dealing with. Yeah. And I wondered whether this was something of interest to you.
I think that's a really interesting, it's actually a thing I hadn't thought about. So it's really, I mean, it's implicit in what I think I'm doing, but I think that's thinking about him as actually almost directly replying to this Malthusian way of thinking would, I think, enrich this in some ways, because I think you're absolutely right. And the answer for him is that an abundance of food will make any kind of population issues not issues, but more than that, the unrepressing of sex, once they figure out a little bit about birth control, but even without it, when he says that thing about, women will become less fertile because like beautifully developed beautifully cultivated flowers that can't reproduce so well anymore. Women in harmony will be like that. You won't have to worry about reproduction, and you won't overpopulate. So the question of population is not overpopulation, and shortage is never an issue in this. But I think it comes back to also what Anjali pointed out about Stallybras's course on parity, that this is parodic as well. So all of these, abundant dinners and orgies, and they're meant as a kind of what happens if you sort of open the gates of libidinal control. The only thing that happens is good. And the Malthus, the grim Malthus projections of overpopulation and starvation are completely off the table or can't be thought in the Fourierist Utopia.
Yeah, I mean, considering how much Malthus has had an impact over subsequent development of species thinking and evolutionary biology, one cannot help but wonder, had, instead of Malthus, Fourier's vision been the influential strand, what kind of a theory of natural selection might have developed instead of the one that we had. I think it has far-reaching implications to maybe juxtapose these two alternative ways of thinking.
Yeah.
For social organization, but also evolution and natural selection and all of those other discourses upon which Malthus has had such an incredible impact. So some food for thought, maybe.
Yeah, also, I think, I don't know if you've read that Ed Cohen article that I cited at the beginning about species, sexual difference in species. It's a really, I mean, let me see if I can find the place. We published it in History of the Present, actually, but it's about the way species thinking is tied to the inevitable sort of reproductive mandate of sexual difference, which is part of that Malthusian story that you're talking about. And it's a piece that just illuminates that question of I'm looking for it, that question of species thinking and sexual difference, which again is something that Fourier is not interested in. So I think if you're interested in pursuing that, and I think that is a really interesting thing to pursue, taking a look at Ed Cohen's article would be useful. I'm just trying to find I don't know where it is now, but
I will. Thank you.
Yeah. No, that's really, I really think that's a really good, the point you're making is a really good one. Yeah, I mean, it's why these guys get called utopian socialists, right? And it's even, even in the 60s, when when Fourier sort of comes back into fashion, the critiques of it are that it's not about the organization of material life, and it's not about social structures. It's about, desire. And what does desire have to do with anything? I mean, it's reading Daniel Bell and even Manuel, some of those people I cite at the beginning. I don't know about Norman O'Brown. I mean, that's a different conversation. But yes, I guess that what we could say actually of what the point you're making is that the moment in the 60s when Marcuse and Norman O'Brown and others turn to psychoanalysis, turn to eros, turn to desire, is an attempt to buy their way out or work their way out of what you're calling a kind of Malthusian conceptualization of how society has to be organized. And the critics of that, like Daniel Bell and others, are interesting to sort of contend with as well. But I think it's no accident that the 60s is where, even though I think I was unaware of it when I was writing my paper, the 60s is the moment when all of this comes back as interesting to entertain as an alternative way of thinking social organization.
Thank you. We have Jonathan, Carla, and Max.
Okay, John Dietrich. I would like to hear you talk more about what you identify as a seeming contradiction, but one that I've found is also is really an important contradiction between the celebration of excess in the new amorous world on the one hand, and the imposition of order and control really at almost every level by the female context in the court of love. This is a problem that I've found over the years in teaching Fourier, that it's hard even to make Fourier credible to many students when what appear to be the constraints that are imposed on people who live in this community are when all that is emphasized. Now, I think one of the ways out of this, one of the ways of dealing with this, I think, is to say that what Fourier is up to, I think, often is a kind of game in which parody is a really important element. And you can read with the Court of Love, the female pontiff, the priestesses, the bands of knight-errantry, all of that is either a parody of courtly love, or in many ways, it's a parody of the Catholic Church. It's a parody of Christianity. And I think what this goes to, in at least, or the place where I would take this, is that I think you're right in underlining the importance of the critical element in all of this. And maybe the Utopia, one wonders sometimes how seriously Fourier took these fantasies. I mean, I think he may have seen them as fantasies. And that what the point of the Court of Love and the point of a lot of this is critical. Rather than drawing any kind of a blueprint.
Well, Jonathan, I have to say that when I was banging my head against the wall with some of this, I was wishing I could talk to you, and I went more than once back to your wonderful biography of Fourier to sort of try to sort through some of these questions. So I'm glad you're here just to talk about it a little bit. I think you're right. I think it's as critique that I read it in the end. And I think I say somewhere that it's a way of directing desire to an alternative form of social organization rather than as a blueprint for society. And I think, I mean, you know more about him than I do, but I think that the parodic aspect of it is really very strong. I mean, including the Court of Love, the Catholic Church, the priests, the priestesses, but also the fairies. I love those fairies and the dancing around and sort of all of it. So yeah, I mean, I think for somebody who was apparently as serious and impoverished and as lonely a figure as he was, this is an amazing fantasy of a parodic fantasy, I guess, is the way, the point of which is critical, as you've said, and I agree, in the sense that what critical work does is direct you to see the limits of your own society and open the possibility for thinking about another one.
It opens your mind.
Yeah. I mean, I also think the constraint and liberation thing, that's I think even as he offers constraints, there's liberation in some of the places. You know, there are places where he's giving you all of these numbers. And there's one place I think where I actually quote it where he says, well, I can't do that. I can't do that calculation because we don't yet know how to, you know, he undermines his own, he's offering this as Newtonian science, but parodically, and he undermines his own insistence on mathematical rigor by coming up with these numbers that mean nothing or that, you know, are phantasmatic, but that also numbers that are also excessive or that he can't pin down. I'm just have this thing on my screen. I'm just looking for that. There's that one place where he sort of says, I can't do this calculation. It's sort of toward the end, I think. Confessors. Yeah, when he says, what page is this? I don't think it has a number. Oh, page 15 on my copy of it anyway. He says, it's not for the individual to choose between these alternatives, the alternatives that are being offered by the way in which the most skillful confessors and confessoresses have been gathered. Their job is to examine these 1,000 knights errant, each of whom must submit a written declaration concerning his or her most recent sexual adventures. The confessors go over these declarations as well as the reports of previous confessors. I mean, this is like a science. They study the immediate inclinations and physical needs of the individuals and attempt to provide him or her with appropriate sympathetic relationships. Putting all of the relevant information together, the confessors determine by means of an equation the balance of contrasts and identities that will be most attractive to each of the adventurers. And then he goes on and says how it's going to be made. And then he says, it is not for the individual to choose between alternatives. His is too much absorbed by his recent memories. It is up to the calm and judicious confessor to determine the type of charm that will arouse his enthusiasm. On the basis of his declarations, the confessor will decide what sort of relationship is most certain to engage his sympathies. All of this work, which involves the use of algebraic formulas, should be completed with the short time of 2 or 3 hours. And then he says, as for the formulas, they cannot be explained yet. It will first be necessary to classify the 110 personality types, any one of which may be represented in an equation of sympathy and may appear in a number of cases. In other words, there's all of this work, right? Setting it forth, these equations and algebra. And then he says that as for the formulas, they cannot be explained just yet. I mean, it's just like he unravels the sort of serious scientific constraint that is being proposed in the form of these confessors. So I just think that you have to read it with a certain sense of humor or attention to the parodic as well as to anything else.
Okay, Carla, and then Max, and then Yasmin. Yasmin.
Thanks for this, Joan. It occurred to me when you were talking about the way that that excess of desire in bodies critiques capitalist economies. It made me wonder if Irigaray was thinking about Fourier in both in her Women on the Market, but more so in the other chapter that gets playfully translated as When the Goods Get Together, in This Sex Which Is Not One, where she argues that what would be produced in this alternative economy is an economy of abundance. Mm-hmm. So, critiquing the notion of desire as lack. Mm-hmm. And then just a little footnote about genre. Mm-hmm. I kind of feel that all utopias also partake of satire and parody. There is always a place in utopian writing that undermines its own claims about its ideal world. And I think, this sounds right up there with all of those.
Yeah, no, thank you. I absolutely, I mean, I don't remember, and I didn't go back to Irigaray to see if she actually cites Fourier, but my suspicion is not, because in all of the time between graduate school and Fourier never quite leaving my preoccupations, I think when I was reading her, if Fourier had come up, I would have paid attention. But that's only a kind of an intuition I have about it not being in there. But now that you mention it, I'll go back and see if I can find Fourier in any of those places. But no, I think you're absolutely right. The economy of abundance, the criticism of desire as lack, that's absolutely what she's onto as the alternative to the sex we have in modernity or modern capitalist society. Yeah.
Okay, my question. So the last line of your paper reads, my return to Fourier resonates with this. It is based on the recognition of the importance of thinking about the role of the unconscious in the making of history. Question is, what if I replace the word unconscious with excess? I go back. And then unconscious is just one term one name for the excess, like as it is desire, pleasure, or even God. There is some place for God in the Fourier's Utopia, and you talk about that. Just in a few lines. So the question is if we address excess, the excess as the center of this text, there are a few implications I would like to discuss with you in the form of a question. So the first one goes back to the last line of your paper. So the role of the excess in the making of history. Then history becomes something like not so much the history of a class struggles. This is the scientific socialism, but history is the history of how we deal with the excess. And Fourier is showing us this difficult thing. How can we deal with the excess? That is not just the unconscious, not just sex or pleasure. It's something that requires harmony. And this is my second question. So what is the harmony? When you list important terms in this paper, you say the proliferation of differences, excess, critique. And so what about harmony? It seems to me that harmony is something that is basically very difficult to define in this text, because is a kind of a tension between the limitlessness, endless pleasure and desire, and the limits, the calculation. And but it's neither the limits, it's neither the harmony is neither the calculation, not the limitlessness of pleasure. It's the tension between these two elements, with the tension between these two dimensions. Whereas a civilization is just a form of a limitation of pleasure. Civilization is a way to repress pleasure, or the excess is a limited form that represses the excess. Fourier is working with a kind of a form that he wants to define in terms of a harmony in which the excess is free to express itself. But at the same time, it's not anarchy. You say that, you know, you cite that lines from Fourier, where Fourier says that love has rules, has courts, institutions, and tribunals. So love is not do whatever you want. So, and then you have this difficult thing of the calculation. That is a kind of a, how we limit something that is a limitlessness without limiting it. And I think this is the aporia. This is where Fourier is going. But it's showing us a kind of a harmony that is always open to self-transformation, not only self-transformation of society, but even of the human beings. It was thinking this future of human beings with a tail, and so this is the question I have. So the role of the excess, and then a kind of a very short question is there something like a right-wing interpretation or appropriation of a Fourier in history, or not? Or the right wing always ignore Fourier? I'm asking because when you evoke the excess is always tricky and can go both ways. There is historically an appropriation of the excess from the right. And I wonder, my question is out of ignorance, if there was historically a kind of attempt of playing with the Fourier from the right-wing perspective. I have no idea.
The last part I don't know. Maybe Jonathan knows something about this. The appropriation of Fourier on the right. I don't know about that. I have no sense of what that would be. But the excess thing, I think that excess is different from the unconscious. Excess may be an effect of unconscious wishes, desires, articulations. But excess itself, and certainly the unconscious exceeds the rational and the conscious. But I sort of worry that you're turning excess into something that, into a sort of a concept that has more to it than I can think with. That is, it's one thing to say that Fourier is that excess is part of what is being presented and lauded in Fourier, and it's excessive all over the place. And excess is understood to be synonymous with liberation. So that the point of liberation is to exceed any possible notion of constraint. But excess, as you're using it, it almost seems like a thing or I mean, I think of the unconscious as a kind of process and as something that is working. And if you want to rename the unconscious excess, well, maybe we could have a conversation about that. But it doesn't work for me in the same way. Partly because the unconscious is referring us to a psychoanalytic theoretical realm of discussions about lack and desire and sex and sexual difference. Excess exceeds, or it doesn't necessarily refer to any of those things. So the unconscious sort of puts me specifically in the mode of trying to think theoretically with psychoanalysis. And excess doesn't do that. I mean, you know, when you talk about, Max, when you talk about democracy and democratic excess, and that which is understood to be outside of the acceptable processes of civilized politics, that's a definition of what is excessive that's historically specific. And for me, yes, the unconscious is a historically specific concept, but I guess I'm using it in a more theoretically ahistoricized way, or something like that. I mean, there's something about excess that is defined, as I read you talking about it, as defined as outside the limits of whatever limits are being proposed, the masses, the unruly masses who will rise up. And yes, we could say there's a parallel to a kind of libidinal excess that they represent. And often, in fact, the excluded classes are represented as libidinally uncontrolled and dangerously so. But I don't know. I need to, excess doesn't do it for me for the reasons I've just said in the same way as the unconscious. You'd have to sort of work out a much more elaborate redefinition for me to be able to sort of go with that. I don't know what other people think. But
John wants to intervene.
No. Not until John is finished. I didn't.
Go ahead.
No, well, no. I
Something on the right wing, maybe.
I just wanted to respond to your question about right wing.
Oh, good. Okay.
There was no, and this is something I know more about than I need to, or want to even. There was no ideological right-wing Fourierist movement. On the other hand, there was a moderate Fourierism that surfaced in, for example, the creation of a consumer cooperative movement. Mm-hmm. there was also around 1848, when most of the Fourierists went Democratic and Republican, and there were Orthodox Fourierists who were very hostile to any kind of politicization of Fourier. And one of the explanations for that, perhaps, is that many of the people who were attracted to Fourier's ideas were actually pretty well off.
Yeah.
And they were lots of army officers, lots of professional people, but they were well-to-do. And of course, it's a real problem, because while it's true that the Nouveau Amoureux wasn't published, and those people didn't want it published. Well, they didn't know about it, most of them. While it's true that there was a kind of, they were skeptical about, they didn't want to get into sexual questions. At the same time, the right wing, they were very conservative politically, and that raises a question, of course, because you don't have to read the Nouveau Monde Amoureux to find Fourier's imagination beginning to run wild.
Right.
I mean, it's there in all of his work, and especially the earlier work. And for me, a big question was always, why do people who are, for the most part, very ordinary people, well-to-do, without great imaginations, what do they find in Fourier? And there's something clearly that drew people who were comfortable and relatively conservative politically to Fourier.
And Jonathan, you don't think it's the sex? You think it's something, because I mean, the alternative to the sex is the communal stuff, right? Is the communal associational organization. I think it could be that there's some, and there maybe we're coming back to the unconscious, but there's some level on which the idea of a kind of sexually liberated world is attractive. You know, it's a kind of, sometimes when you read some of his descriptions of these things, it's like reading about the aristocracy and about, you know, all the liaisons dangereuses that one associates with aristocratic sexual practices.
Yeah, but I think as far as sex goes, it was the women who were drawn in. What is wonderful in a way is to study the beginnings of French feminism in the 1830s and 40s, and there's some really extraordinary women who were radicalized by Fourier.
No, but I was thinking of the sort of conservatives that you're talking about, the army officers, that, you know, those who are opposed to politicization. They would be opposed to the kind of communal socialistic proposals that you know, people like Considérant want to sort of form these communal societies. But for some of the others, I would think the free sex would have some kind of appeal. You know, this is entirely hypothetical, but it could well be that would be an appeal for them.
Yeah, I'm not convinced.
Okay.
Okay, Yasmin.
Thank you so much, Joan, for this paper and this talk. It's really a pleasure and very thought-provocative. I wanted to ask you a question that is kind of coming out of the spirit in which you end, or with which you end the paper, in which you say in the epilogue, I asked how the text was operating rather than focusing exclusively on what it said. I found that very intriguing, maybe also because it aligns with some of the ways I think about my own work. So in that spirit, I wanted to ask you about the extent to which you saw Fourier's renditions of desire and love difference, passionate attraction, as historic, like of him thinking of them as his historical or products of history in any way. I see, of course, in your paper the way you cite him as invoking nature and God's will, and juxtaposing his rendition of desire, love, attraction as the natural one vis-a-vis the French Revolution's institution of marriage as the kind of the unnatural order of things. But I was just wondering about whether now that we're reading Fourier in this context of what his text was doing, as opposed to what he himself believed or intended, whether there was a ways in which you saw him as meaningfully historicizing desire, perhaps thinking of, to the extent to which, for example, he thought of his own sexual, fantasies, or the fantasies that he wanted to embody in his Utopia as imaginings of as themselves like a product of what was repressed, and therefore as kind of reactions to the order of things as it stood. I could also not help, as I was reading, especially with his invocations of God's will, about the extent to which what he was describing in extent was an imagining of like heaven on earth, unbridled desire that was nevertheless insatiable. So, just some thoughts that came to me about, again, how his text operated for us as readers.
Well, one of the things about just the historicizing of his own position is he has this stage theory of historical development. There are, Jonathan will remember 7 or 8 stages of barbarian, blah, 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 civilization. And we are now past that. Those are all corrupt and repressive in one form or another. They're all barbaric, even though those who pretend now to be civilized are as barbaric, but in other ways as their predecessors. And we're at a new stage when humanity can finally realize this utopian vision that he purports to have. So there is a notion of historical progress. We're now at the stage where this can be realized when it couldn't be before. And just as we need a Newton to give us the laws of gravity, now we need Fourier to give us the laws of passionate attraction. So in that sense, there's a gesture, at least. I mean, I think, but that's also very much the way people are thinking about history in that period. There's nothing new or original in that. He's kind of evoking stage theories of history and placing himself at the top. So that's part of, I think, what your question was. What I meant by reading it, not literally, was sort of trying to figure out, as I try to do in some of these places, what's going on beyond what he's sort of saying, what he's describing, what's at stake in promoting, in offering these visions of abundance and so it's just a matter of it's the interpretive move beyond the literal descriptive one. I think that's the best way to describe it. And for me, trying to think psychoanalytically, because the topic was sex and desire, it seemed like a useful way to a lens through which to try to think some of these things. Although the whole paper is not a psychoanalytic reading. I mean, a lot of the stuff is just trying to make sense of things like excess or parity or the relationship of the sort of mathematical to the liberational or the unrepressed, that kind of thing. So it's just I think an invitation to sort of go beyond what I think of as that first paper I wrote, which was in 1964, which was just, it was perfectly fine paper, but it was just a description of everything that was in the text. He says this, he says that. This seems totally crazy to me. He says the seas are going to, turn into drinkable lemonade, that we're all going to grow tails with eyes in them so that, people are following us. We won't have to turn our heads. It's just kind of, so I was just basically musing in that paper about the craziness of some of it, but not being able to kind of figure out beyond description what was actually going on. And this is not to say this tells you what's actually going on, but it's my reading of what's sort of driving the imagination of this guy as he's proposing this new loving world. I don't know if that answers the question.
I had just a quick follow-up, and maybe
Yeah.
I missed that in the paper. When the historical development scheme makes total sense in terms of the context and all. And I was just wondering whether he viewed that as the ultimate stage, or whether there were subsequent ones.
Oh yeah, there's going to be decline. There's going to be, in I don't know how many thousand years, everything's going to go to hell. Here we are, right? Yeah, but the Anthropocene, he didn't call it that, but here we are sitting on the verge of dissolution without having realized harmony. But yes, there's the stage theory is a kind of follows the human life cycle, and there will be at some ultimate point decline.
Okay.
So in some ways, let's get with it while we can, and realize the possibilities while we can.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Other questions or comments? Okay. In the meanwhile, I can go back 1 second to
excess. Yes, we have to have an argument about excess next.
Well, I just, while you were talking, I thought, to me, basically, unconscious is the technical name that a very specific discipline that is called the psychoanalysis gives or has given to the excess. And in a certain way, the work of this discipline that we call psychoanalysis is to discipline the excess. So we have so many different disciplines whose work is to discipline the excess.
Mm-hmm.
And what Fourier is doing in a disturbing way, he frees the excess.
Right.
And this is also kind of an anti-civilization gesture, because a civilization is a way to determine places for the many different things, to establish fixity, if you want. Whereas the work of the excess is the opposite, is undoing fixity. So, and then the entire social, theoretical, political problem is how do we deal with that? When you make everything basically unstable, but only till a certain point, because then you need a calculation in order to stabilize the instability. So I think it's doing something that is theoretically possible, is trying to define a balance between the limited forms that we have with the excess.
Right.
But at the same time, I think this is the very provocative thing you can find in that text. And maybe the other question is, why did it do it at that time? What made, historically, why was it possible to address that kind of a new set of questions and problems? One can say maybe historically societies had to manage scarcity but there is a kind of historical turning point that makes possible for society now to manage abundance instead of scarcity. And that is the moment in which a new possible way of thinking are liberated.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think maybe it's the French Revolution.
Yeah.
The excesses of which he hated, the Jacobins, the sort of the terror, all of that which he hated, but which in that first quote that I give from him says, it missed its chance to really be a revolution by keeping the family in place. So in that sense, the ability to think excessively comes at this revolutionary moment when there are ways to think beyond. There's been a real experience of the possibilities of living beyond the whatever the limits of social order actually are.
Yeah, I agree with the Fourier, and actually I wrote that Robespierre is the tyrant who kept the democratic excess.
Right, exactly.
And Robespierre used the terms in a derogatory way. I think Fourier was the thinker, maybe the first thinker of the democratic excess that Robespierre killed.
I think and he lived it, right? So. So he sides with democratic excess against Robespierre. In your I agree, and I think you're right that psychoanalysis is one of the ways in which modernity, if we want to call it that, works to discipline the excess, whatever the excess that the unconscious represents. I think that. So I guess I don't disagree with you. I think, and the balance between excess and control is what he's constantly trying to sort of figure out and undo, even as he's offering the balance. So in that quote I read you earlier, in which he says, "Well, we don't have those equations yet. We can't really do it," and that matters. But I think that for this paper and the kind of argument I want to make in that conclusion, I would stick with the role of the unconscious, just because that's sort of where I've stayed. But I think were I to do something further with this, and I'm not sure I can or want to, introducing your notion of excess and the revolutionary moment as the moment of possibility for thinking the relationship to excess would be a really useful thing to do in the paper.
Yeah. I wanted basically to push you, from, so if Marx say that the history is a history of a class struggles, I wanted to push you to find another definition of history that is closer to Fourier, and history is history of the excess and how society deals with the excess.
Yeah.
And maybe class struggle is like the unconscious, just a manifestation of the excess.
Yeah, well, the class struggle is yet another. I mean, what you're saying, and you're doing this, I think you should do this, you're the philosopher, is that you're offering excess as a sort of larger category to think the struggles of history, whether they're class struggles, whether they're, this kind of repression, the disciplining of desire and sexuality, whatever it is. I mean, excess for you, I think, is a critical term for expanding our understanding of what's at stake in these different kinds of struggles. And Fourier then becomes, for you, Fourier could be one of the chapters in your book on excess. No, I think it's what you said is very helpful. But I think I want to sort of stick to the psychoanalytic in this, just because that is where my thinking about it came from, about fantasy, about desire, But then, you know, we could also take that Norman O'Brown quote from the epigraph from the very beginning. And there it is. The riddle of history is not in reason, but in desire, not in labor, but in love. And you might want to say the riddle of history is not in reason or desire, but in excess. And leave it at that.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Okay. We have a 10 minutes for 15 minutes for other questions or comments. Yes, Gabriel.
Sure. Thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Scott. It's really a pleasure to have you here. I guess I'm curious if, and maybe this is a question for others who are knowledgeable about this, to what extent Fourier has emerged as a resource for other, either, you know, queer utopian projects, gay utopias, gay dropout cultures. I know that Sophie Lewis is using Fourier today to think about the abolition of the family, but I'm just curious if there are other moments in the last half century or even century that we could think about where this kind, not utopianism broadly, and I think there's a lot of ways that it's influenced itself in North American utopian projects, even if it's unconsciously, but specifically and explicitly how this has maybe continued on as a resource.
Well, I'm sure Jonathan can help me here because he's, you know, has the sense of the more expansive world. There's a book that was written recently, and I can't, since they don't allow footnotes in the Raritan thing, I can't find the note. The guy's name is something like Boucher. It's an attempt to rethink French socialism in terms of attention to sensibility, to sort of the other things besides the material. And Fourier is a big, do you know the book, Jonathan? It came out a couple of years ago.
Yes. Yes, it's Thomas Boucher. And
Boucher.
It's a kind of Fourier's take on the history of socialism in a way. Yeah, he's a good friend.
It's a really interesting book, and it's I don't know beyond that of, you know, particular examples, Gabriel, that you're talking about, but that book, if you read French, that book is worth looking at because he's trying to bring these kinds of considerations through Fourier back into socialist conversations.
We have time for a last question. Okay.
What's really sad, Max, is that we now can't go out and have a grand bouffe. You know, 10,000 bottles of wine and 15 creme caramels or creme whatevers that he always liked for dessert.
Yeah. Now, this is the amazing thing. It's the calculation of this, you know, 10,000 bottle of wines and what is 12 passions and the combination in 800 human types. But I think 810.
810, right.
Yeah, it gives you the sense of, you know, just big numbers. And I think especially, you know, for a non-mathematical mind, it's just, it's abundance. It's just a lot. This is, I think, is a way to point out that there is an excess that can be managed in a certain way. But we don't have the equations yet.
By which to manage. No, I mean, it is the way in which, what we talked about before, the way in which this sort of phantasmatic projection inspires both dissatisfaction with what we have and the sense of a possibility that it could be something else. And that, that's what one needs or wants in texts of social transformation, I think.
Okay. If there is not any, oh yes, there is a Yasmin as a comment or a question or follow up. Please, Yasmin.
Yes, I kind of had a question in the spirit of this conversation about maybe the tension of many texts of social transformation between the reading of our natural inclinations on one hand, and the impulse, which, as you put it via Dibou in the paper, to compose ardent and insatiable desire. So there's this kind of, Fourier seems to want to open things up for us, but also to compose them in a particular direction, if we take Dibou's reading, which you seem to do. And I was wondering whether on your reading, Fourier acknowledged that tension between the naturalness and the composability or amenability to be composed in a particular direction, or if he didn't.
I think the effort is there, but I don't know of a literal acknowledgement of that, because it was more that he's presenting this as, the Newtonian science of the passions, and so, and in some ways, I guess that's what I meant in that thing you pointed to at the very end about reading him literally versus reading him for things like that, those kinds of tensions, which he's wrestling with, but not articulating as such.
Thanks. No, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay. Joan, thank you so much
for
your generosity and for this excellent, amazing conversation.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you all for being here, and let's be in touch.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much again. Bye, Joan.
Thank you. It's really good to see all of you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Max, I can stop the recording on my end. I'm going to try that so it saves to my account.
Oh, okay.
Just letting you know. Goodbye.
Yep. Bye-bye.